Number 6, nitrogen use and management in irrigated agriculture. This time we'll hear from a panel of experts on the use of nitrogen fertilizers and reporting of nitrogen management in irrigated agriculture. This is an information item only and no action will be taken, although the board may ask questions regarding the presentations. Following the presentations, interested parties will be allowed 3 minutes each to address the board. We'll now begin with the presentations, being led by Dr. Doug Parker from the UC President's Office. That's right.
So Dr.
Office
Longley,
President.
this was at the request of the board to have this panel. If timing had allowed us, we would have had it earlier in the process, but I contacted Doug. I've worked with Doug on a number of things. He's been active with the Irrigated Lands Program, especially in the Central Coast. And so working with him, I put together, basically asked him to create a panel to help answer some questions for the board. And I did poll the board for questions, and Dr. Longley gave me a series of things he's interested in learning about. So I presented that to Doug, and with that, he put together this panel. And Doug, were you going to go through the resumes or bios, or do you want me to go through those?
I'll let you do it.
Okay.
Sure.
So we have a panel of 4. So Doug is the Dr. Parker is the director of the California Institute for the Water Resources and Strategic Initiative, leader for the California Institute for Water Resources and Strategic Initiative, and he's the leader of the Water Initiative. He is the director. He's the director of the California Institute of Water Resources and Strategic Initiative, leader for the UC Agriculture and Natural Resources Water Quality, Quantity, and Security Strategic Initiative. He coordinates water-related research, extension and education efforts across the 10 UC campuses, the UC Agricultural and Natural Resource System, and other academic institutions within California. Prior to joining the University of California, Doug worked on water quality issues related to the Chesapeake Bay as an associate professor and extension specialist in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Maryland. He also worked on issues related to California water as a cooperative extension economist at UC Berkeley. Doug obtained his PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics at UC Berkeley and bachelor's degrees in Economics and Environmental Studies at UC Santa Barbara. So Doug will be opening this item, and then the panelists will include 3 individuals. The first is Patrick Brown. Dr. Brown is a professor of plant nutrition and horticulture at the University of California, Davis. He obtained his PhD in agronomy and international agricultural development from Cornell University and has been a professor at UC Davis since 1989. Dr. Brown research focuses on the uptake, function, and management of nutrients in agricultural plants and covers fields from basic biology to field management and extension methodologies. He has published 140 peer-reviewed scientific articles and several hundred industry-focused publications and communications. Primarily, research focused over the past 10 years for Dr. Brown has been the optimization of nitrogen use in almond and pistachios. And he will discuss nitrogen management for the board. Dan Monk. Dan Monk has, for the past 23 years, Dan has worked with the UC Cooperative Extension as an irrigation, soils, and cotton farm advisor in Fresno County. He spent his early career evaluating soil and management factors influencing infiltration rates in soils. He has studied subsurface drip irrigation for row crops and evaluated plant growth and development dynamics of San Joaquin Valley cotton. Dan began investigating cropping systems research in the late 1990s and is currently involved in several conservation tillage projects focused on short and long-term water management elements in annual cropping systems. More recently, he has worked on crop water use monitoring projects in almonds, processing tomatoes, and Pima cotton, and has a long interest in California water resource management. And finally, Alan Fulton has been a University of Cooperative Extension farm advisor for nearly 26 years, 11 years in King County in the San Joaquin Valley and 15 years in Tehama County in the Sacramento Valley. In between the 2 farm advisor positions, he also worked 4 years in the private agricultural sector as an irrigation manager and pest control advisor for a family-incorporated farm in the San Joaquin Valley. He is headquartered in Red Bluff, California. He completed a bachelor's degree in plant and soil science and a master's degree in soils and irrigation sciences from Colorado State University. He works in the four-county area of Tehama, Glenn, Colusa, and Shasta counties. His extension activities focus on irrigation practices that use water efficiently and productively, farming practices to protect and enhance surface and groundwater quality, and community-wide policies to manage groundwater and surface water resources. And with that, I'll let Doug take over.
Before Doug takes over, Doug has told me that they're compressing a day and a half into 60 minutes or less. And, I just think that we're going to be inundated today, and we probably need to find a way down the road to continue this conversation. With that, Doug, looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, what I'd like to do is, we've got 3 other speakers here to talk about nitrogen management. What I want to do is brief the board quickly on the curriculum development and training in nitrogen management. So as you know, we've been, this team has been, and others beyond this team, involved in a series of trainings for certified crop advisors on nitrogen management, working with CDFA. So we had just completed 5 of those trainings. I wanted to bring a little bit up to date on how those trainings went. And again, as Dr. Longley mentioned, those trainings were a day and a half. We're going to bring some pieces of those trainings out for the board today, but we're certainly happy to come back and talk about other pieces and other places that we can talk about as well. So in terms of the trainings, again, these trainings were for certified crop advisors only. They're the ones who will be certified to sign off on nitrogen management plans or on nitrogen reporting, depending on how all of that works out over the next year. We did 5 trainings and trained about, well, we had 549 people sign up for the trainings. 529 actually completed the trainings. A few no-shows. A couple people just came for one day, so that they didn't get certified if they didn't stay for the whole thing. But it was the largest set of trainings ever done for CCAs in the state. So most of these trainings were sold out, and so people traveled to other locations to get the trainings at times as well. So the program, again, was a day and a half session, and I'll run through it just to give you an idea of what we were training people on. The first day was sort of a general session, pretty common throughout all 5 locations. The second day, we broke the group to talk about annual crops or permanent crops, and we tailored those sessions to the locations we were in. So we tried to pick crops that were grown near those woodland locations or Fresno or Salinas locations, et cetera, for that second day. We're putting all of that information online for the people who took the training. It'll be a public website, so anybody can actually go and look at it if they have any interest in it. The curriculum outline, just to give you a piece of what we did, was we began with sort of talking about the course, why were people there, how can nutrient management training not only help the environment, but help the farmer's bottom line as well, because if they're able to use nutrients more efficiently, they obviously should be having increases in profits. Then we had presentations on the nitrogen cycle and crop production systems. So these were fairly detailed presentations on the chemistry of the nitrogen cycle. Dr. Brown was the one doing most of those, and he's going to do some of that today, but I don't think he's going to get to that level of detail for all of you. We had very good responses to the training on that type of stuff. A lot of the CCAs saw the training as very good, bringing in that back up to speed on where they needed to be. Some of them saw it as new material, others saw it as sort of review of material. They all come in with different levels of expertise, although a certain level of bar of expertise because they were CCAs. Then we discussed nitrogen sources, so we talked about commercial fertilizer, organic sources, different types of commercial fertilizers as well, foliar treatments, all types of different nitrogen sources. Irrigation and nitrogen management was a big part of what we talked about as well, and we're going to talk about some of that today, so I'll let them bring that up. And then nitrogen budgeting was discussed. And then some general stuff, future resources, tools they may be able to use, online web tools, things like that that are being developed or already developed. And we also had a space at the end of the first day for the regional boards to come and give an update on what's going on in their region, so the CCAs were up to date on where they were. And then, as I mentioned, day 2, we broke them into annual or permanent crops and really got down and talked a little bit about how would you manage it for this crop. What would you do if you had this scenario? What would you do if there was some tweak in the scenario, an unforeseen event, weather event, or something else that made you have to kind of change mid-season what you wanted to do? In terms of who took the training, you can see that the majority of the people work directly for fertilizer companies. about 42%. About 20% worked for a crop production company. 14% were independent consultants. 16% worked directly for growers. And then about 7 or 8% worked, had just sort of other in terms of who took the training. Locations, most in the Central Valley. Some also a fair number in the Central Coast. A few people from Southern California came up to take the training, some from the North Coast, and even some from the Imperial region made the trip in order to take these trainings.
Doug, how closely do you think, and this is subjective judgment, does this coincide with actually the use of fertilizers? This breakout on.
Oh, in terms of the
Right.
people on the, obviously, I mean, I would say if I were trying to look at the use of fertilizers, I'd probably base it, not knowing what the different regions are doing, mostly on the basis of acreage and crop production. And so this would be weighted, much more towards the Central Valley. And I think people saw the Central Valley as the place where most of the nitrate issues are being talked about, and Salinas Valley. So you see those two are the two big here. We didn't do trainings in the other areas, and the boards in the other areas are following different paths right now too. So there may be future needs for trainings in those areas.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And here's a little bit about experience of the people. Most of the people had over 15 years of experience working in the field. A few with, 10% had 0 to 5, 6 to 10, or 11 to 15, about 10 to 15%, 12% of each of those, and then 65% over 15 years. There are a lot of people currently taking the CCA training, and so those numbers keep growing. But just people taking the test aren't always just new to the field. They may be people who've been PCAs or pesticide control advisors working in agriculture for a number of years. They just never got that training. And then we asked them sort of what was most helpful, and this breaks into way too many possibilities, but the nitrogen budgeting was by far the thing people felt was the most useful of everything. Some people thought the whole training was useful, about 33%. The nitrogen cycle was very useful. Irrigation was very useful, and kind of a scattering of other kind of things that people found useful in part of the training. And we asked them, do you feel you're better able to manage nitrogen and meet requirements? And the majority of people definitely said yes after going through the day and a half of training. And a little bit, we did some questions on sort of how is your change in understanding of using nitrogen changed from the training. So you can see what you see on here is, so the first top one here is my overall understanding of nitrogen management before the training and after, and you see sort of a shifting downward of people from slight to moderate down into the good to complete level of understanding of nitrogen management. And again, in terms of irrigation management and relationship, we see the same type of shifts in all of these. More people who didn't feel they're very comfortable with it before felt a lot more comfortable afterwards, and their capacity to advise the development of nitrogen management plans, again, increasing as we went through those trainings. So that, I just wanted to give you a background on that, but what we really want to talk about more today is on the ground, how do we manage nitrogen? What are some of the complexities that growers face? And some of that's going to come right out of those trainings. As I mentioned, we're going to take slices of the trainings and give that to you today, and then be open for questions. So I'll take, if there's any questions on my piece right now before I turn it over to Patrick now.
I just have one question.
Sure.
So you said 529 people were trained. Do we have an idea of how many crop advisors there are in the state or in the valley, and whether we have an adequate mass that will be trained and prepared to help growers?
Yeah, so currently there's something around 830, 840 certified crop advisors. I believe that's the current number who have passed the test. I know in February about 150 or so took the test again, but so those aren't concluded in that, and I don't know how many pass. I don't know what the pass rate is on the test. It's actually a fairly difficult test, so it's not like 80% of people pass. It's actually a bit lower. So, we should be getting up close to 1,000 within a year or so. The question of whether that's an adequate number is kind of subjective. Nobody's really looked at it yet. I think it's a great number to reach the majority of the farmland. When we start talking about smaller and smaller acreages and stuff, then we have different questions. If you're 10 acres or, how small of a farm do we want to go down to when we look at these things? And I think those people are less likely. It certainly covers probably the majority of the farmland, though.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Doug.
Thanks. Okay. I'll let you find yours on there.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to the board. As Doug mentioned, I'm going to distill my 4.5 hours of speaking at the CCA training into 15 minutes. And what I chose to do here is give you the perspective of nitrogen management as it was presented to the certified crop advisors. It's also the perspective that we've been presenting to almond growers, pistachio growers. Since I work primarily in the tree crops, there's a bit of a tree crop focus here, though the principles hold true across all of the different crops. I'm going to use this diagram, which we put up multiple times in the presentations. And when you think about nitrogen cycle and how to optimize nitrogen management in agriculture, it's really about balancing your supply with your demand, getting to the trees, to the crops, the amount of nitrogen needed when they're needed to ensure that productivity is maximized, but at the same time minimize the opportunity for loss from the system. There are some complexities. It makes a nice easy diagram here, however, the devil is in the details. On the supply side of the equation, some of the inputs are, of course, easily quantified, the commercial nitrogen fertilizer that you put into the system. It is also relatively easy to quantify the amount of nitrogen that comes in with the irrigation water. I'll show you a formula for that later on. Where we have some complexity is in the contributions that's coming not only from cover crops, manures, and composts, but importantly, and particularly for the annual cropping systems, complexity that comes in from recycling of waste of plant materials in the field. In the case of broccoli, for example, lettuce, a large amount of the nitrogen that was in the crop is returned to the field in crop residues. There are indeed a good deal of complexity in the nitrogen cycle in the soil. The ultimate goal of any nitrogen management program is to keep in the soil only what is adequate for the plant to grow at full productivity, and not to have in the soil an excess which, if managed poorly, is a potential loss for the to the cycle. The third part of the complexity that's involved is the demand part of the equation. Implicit in this budget act, in this balancing act, I should say, is the ability to estimate what crop demand for nitrogen will be. And that's important to do not only on a mass balance, how many pounds per year is taken off the crop in a broccoli harvest or an almond harvest, but also when during the cycle that demand occurs and how to deliver the nitrogen with explicit timing that matches the demand of the crop. So we'll step through some of those attributes and where the complexities are. Towards the end, I will show some examples of field research and where we have managed to get the efficiency of use quite high, and where the outcome and what a reasonable estimate would be for cropping systems in California. Implicit in nitrogen cycle, of course, is also water management. Nitrogen that sits in the soil has the potential to be lost if not taken up by plants, but that potential is only realized if water pushes that nitrogen below the root zone. So you can maintain high levels of nitrate in the root zone. That does not represent a threat if water is not present to push it through the cycle. My colleagues will talk a little more about water management and how that ties into this process and this balancing act. There's a framework which we've used with the certified crop advisors and growers that puts this in perspective, and efficient nitrogen management can be summarized in these 4 R's. The goal is to apply the right rate, and what we mean by right rate is to match the supply with the demand. Implicit in that, of course, is to know what all of your supply factors are, what nitrogen is coming from fertilizer, what nitrogen is coming from irrigation water, what nitrogen is coming from the soil itself. Also critical to that is the right time, optimizing the availability of nitrogen in the cycle with the demand of the crop, putting the nitrogen in the right place. I'll show some examples of where making that mistake diminishes efficiency dramatically, and using the right source and the right monitoring and evaluation techniques. So how do you take that first step, finding what the right rate is? You know, if you're dealing with a celery crop or a broccoli crop, it's a fairly simple process. You take samples during the year, you look at the total biomass, total nitrogen accumulation over time, and you use that to construct a demand curve. When you deal with the tree crops, it's a little bit more difficult because you've got to deal with the entire biomass of the plant, and a lot of growers are not particularly keen on tree harvesting in the way that we talk about tree harvesting, chopping them out of the ground and partitioning them. But having done that for a lot of different crops and searched the literature, you can come up with numbers such as this. So this is a list of a variety of crops, heavy on the horticultural crops here, and it tells you how much nitrogen to expect will be in the crop exported from the field on the basis of the yield itself. I put a stars there next to the numbers which we have got a good solid research basis on. The remaining numbers are mostly drawn from the literature without a California-specific analysis, though they will be representative. Now, of course, what's removed from the crop is a very adequate estimate of demand in an annual cropping system. When you get to a perennial cropping system, you need also to have information on what is being taken up into the growing tree, what is required for growing new architecture, new trunks, new stems, etc. And I'm going to put a couple of examples of this to illustrate the point. In this case, this is orange. This is data derived from Italian work, actually, not UC work. But a couple of things to illustrate here. Estimated uptake in this particular case, and this is corresponding to a moderate yield. This 20,000 pound yield would be considered moderate to moderate low in Californian context. And of that 74 pounds that's taken from the soil, only 26 pounds is removed from the orchard, with the remaining 40 pounds, 50 pounds going into woody organs, going into leaves, and a fair proportion of that returning to the soil. So in order to generate and make sense of these sorts of budgets, you need to partition them into these different fractions, determine not only what's leaving the orchard, but also what is implicitly required for the tree to grow. If you contrast this version here, which is for orange fleshy fruits, and it would be quite similar for peaches and pears and apricots and things like that, with what you can see in an almond context, and you'll see here the uptake values in this case, 305 pounds for a moderate high yield of 4,000 pounds. And contrast that with the previous, we're at 74 pounds. Also contrast the amount of nitrogen that is being removed from the field, 272 pounds, tenfold greater than was removed in the orange crop. So there's a very good deal of crop specificity in developing these budgets. There's a requirement that the information is available and developed. You will notice in this particular case, the amount of allocation that goes to the trees for growing the wood, it does not differ very much between orange. What differs is the export. If you look at the case in vegetable crops, these are some numbers derived by Tim Hartz at UC. A couple of things to illustrate here. We're looking, in this case, lettuce, broccoli, celery, spinach, and strawberry. The nitrogen removal and harvest, which is on the right-hand side here, I have numbers in the middle range. So this is somewhere between what a peach tree would do, an orange tree would do, and what a nut crop would do. The difference and the important difference in the annual crops is that there is a very substantial amount of nitrogen that is taken up into the biomass, the broccoli stalks, the lettuce roots, the celery stalks, etc., that is not removed from the orchard, from the field. So in this case, removals in the 60 to 80s, total crop uptake in the range of 100 through 200, and you have application rates here in the range of 100 to 200, 250. So there, if you look at the balance between what is applied and balance that against total uptake, that's fairly good balance there. If you balance what is applied against what is removed, application rates are 1.5 or twofold higher than removal. In the annual cropping system, this represents a challenge in management because you have in the field a large amount of nitrogen that is cycling through the residues that becomes a difficult form of nitrogen to manage, when it will be available to the plant, how much of it's going to be available this year versus next year. So annual crops face a different series of challenges than perennial crops do because of this very large recycling factor that goes on. So if we look at this cartoon again, I've illustrated some of the complexities there in the supply component, calculations of how we get to the demand component, and introduced that in the soil nitrogen cycling, this becomes a big challenge for the annual crop systems that recycle large amounts of nitrogen in the soil. So you can put this all together in a sort of a worksheet, just a simple equation, demand on the left, which we've described, and then the supply on the right. And the supply of nitrogen can come from nitrogen in the soil derived from those residues that are being cycled. It can come from supply in the soil from compost and manures and other attributes that are added. We have in most systems of flood irrigated cropping agronomic systems some reasonable knowledge of this parameter. In the tree crops, we have a very poor knowledge of this parameter. They're very different systems, and we've not done the research in this regard. Nitrogen in the water, that's a fairly simple equation I'll show you in a moment, and nitrogen in the fertilizer. There is always the question, of course, what is the relative efficiency of these different sources? I'll show you some estimates of those in a moment.
And to that point, this equation would suggest that the difference, in other words, the inefficiency times the supply, is never available to the crop. Is that possibly available to the crop in later years, or?
I'll show you an example of that later on. Nitrogen that is not used in a current season because the supply was in excess of the demand, as providing it is not washed through the soil with an irrigation or a rainfall event, is indeed available for the subsequent year. So you cannot separate the nitrogen management from the irrigation management. However, since you can't necessarily predict rainfall over the winter in a lot of our regions, the fundamental principle of keeping this as tight as possible in all years is a valuable one. But it is a good point to illustrate that nitrogen is not lost merely because it's out of balance. It's only lost if it is both out of balance and leached.
Thank you.
There we go. So in terms of the inorganic, the contributions that come from organic manures, etc., there is a lot of data that illustrates how much nitrogen you will get in a ton of a compost or a raw manure. And that's valuable preliminary information, but estimating how that supply of compost is reflected in current year nitrogen uptake by the plant, that's a difficult science, which we're still resolving and getting more information on. The nitrogen in irrigation water, there are some fairly straightforward equations. You just multiply the concentration of the nitrogen by the amount of water, and it generates the number of pounds provided. There is some questions, of course, about how efficient nitrogen, when provided in the irrigation water, how efficient is that as a source of nitrogen? We are undertaking a CDFA FREP-funded project to address those questions right now. But in the interim, we've established that we've been working on the premise that 70% efficiency is what you can expect, which is the same sort of efficiency levels that you would expect from a fertilizer application. So for the moment, that's what we've been utilizing as our basis. You can do some very simple equations. In this particular case, it seems to, if we had 2,500 pounds of almond, we know that there's 68 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 pounds of almond. That gives you 170 pounds of nitrogen demand. This is not fertilizer demand, this is nitrogen demand. You then subtract from that what you've got from the water. You come up with a very simple equation, says there's 153 pounds of nitrogen required. The next question then becomes, how do I provide 153 pounds of nitrogen, recognizing that not every pound of fertilizer will become available? There's been discussion, and the dairy order utilizes this number of 70% efficiency. And so for this discussion, I will utilize that as well. You just simply multiply or divide these by 0.7. You generate a fertilizer nitrogen rate. Now, I think it's relevant here to think about this 70% and what are the circumstances where this can be achieved and what are the conditions under which it will not be achieved or it will be compromised. A lot of it depends upon the knowledge of the crop advisor, knowledge of the grower, and how tightly and effectively they can implement those 4 R's that I mentioned previously: right rate, right time, right placement, right source. There are some key examples of where this efficiency cannot be achieved, and I'm going to just show very briefly some of these. Year-to-year variability in yield, poor irrigation practices, my colleagues will mention that in a moment, variability in the field, poor timing. So this is a graph of pistachio. Now, pistachio is notorious for being very variable in its yield.
If I could interrupt,
Yep.
Excuse me. So what about carryover nitrogen?
Okay, carryover nitrogen I'll actually address here in a moment on this particular slide, actually. I always like good questions that predict to the next slide. Okay, so in this particular case, these are yields. It's all relative to the 2005 yield, which is the 100% here. But you see yield variability all the way down to a 2006 incident where the yield was only 5% or 10% of the maximal capable yield of that field. Now, under this circumstance, if a fixed nitrogen rate were applied, 270 pounds, 250 pounds every year, you generate efficiencies overall of 60%, with the majority of the inefficiency coming from the poor yield year where the fertilization rate was not adjusted accordingly. Now, in terms of the carryover issue, you will see certainly in that subsequent year you have an apparent efficiency of greater than 100%. How do you get an apparent efficiency of greater than 100%? It means the nitrogen that was in excess from that prior year is available for the plants. So in this circumstance, we don't have an estimate of how much was lost, but you certainly have an implication that carry forward from prior year activities is a valuable source of nitrogen.
So for tree crops especially, nitrogen that you apply this year will affect your yield for next year. It affects your yield this year to a degree, but it mostly affects your yield for the next year. You're setting the fruit crop, the fruiting tree limbs and stuff like that for next year, this year. So how does that factor into this and the budgeting that a grower might want to do?
Certainly this year's status impacts next year, but I think it's incorrect to say the majority of the impact of this year's fertilization is on next year. And the reason I say that is if you look at a pistachio and almond crop, the crop will export in a single year in the realm of 200 pounds of nitrogen in a good crop. The amount of nitrogen required to grow a tree optimally is 20 pounds. So if you are only interested in growing the biomass for next year, you need only provide the 20 to 35 pounds of nitrogen. If you want to grow the crop, you need the 200. So most of the action, if you want to put it that way, is indeed in the current year. In lower export crops, peaches, fresh market peaches as an example, that ratio between nitrogen going in the crop and nitrogen going into next year's growth is about 50-50 as opposed to 90%, 10% in the tree crops. One of the big issues that's come up, as we increase field size, you decrease the ability to be efficient. And it's illustrated here. There's a pistachio field, a 40-hectare field, 80-acre field. And the colors just represent different yield zones of the field. And so you have portions of the field, the blues and the greens, very high yielding. You have portions of the field, reds and yellows, small, lower yield. Now, in most California fields, you only have a single point at which you can inject fertilizers into the system. So now you're faced with a challenge. What part of this field should I optimize, and how should I fertilize this field given that this variation occurs? Now, when we talk about efficiency factors in a moment, one of the key drivers of inefficiency is this variability in yield. Now, this matters much more in circumstances where there's a lot of winter rainfall, where that nitrogen can be lost from the system, and less in systems where there's less winter rainfall, where that leftover nitrogen can be used the subsequent year. Now, it's sort of a counterintuitive as we move to larger fields and more fertigation and single point injection, we actually introduce inefficiencies when we may be intuitively thinking we're getting more technical and decreasing inefficiencies. So what could a grower do? They could split the field up into 5-acre plots. That would be a nightmare of management. You could split it into 10-acre plots, possibility. You could even just split it in half. And we were asked, Pamela mentioned, so what does this mean in terms of efficiencies? In this particular case, just as an example, if you treated these two halves of the field independently, you can save 1,700 pounds of nitrogen and increase your nutrient use efficiency 25%. So these are the sorts of things that growers and consultants need to think about in getting to that next level of efficiency. Now, underlying this, of course, there's a lot more complexity than I'm illustrating.
What sort of factors would lead to the differences in production that we see in this slide?
So part of this would be a differential soil characteristics, water retention, unfavorable. This was west side Kern County, so there were some unfavorable soil conditions, high alkalinity, poor root permeability. So some of it is that. Some of it, and as I said, there's a lot more complexity in here, is the nature of pistachio. If you look at this field in the subsequent year, the pattern reverses. So what was high this year becomes low next year. And it really illustrates the need for a sophisticated agronomist to be aware of that and to react accordingly. On occasions I'm asked when I present this, well, that's all very nice, Patrick, but what am I going to do about it? And at the moment, my only response is, well, you could pretend it's not there. And clearly that's not a viable response. And there is some economic incentive here to put in a valve and save that 1,700 pounds of nitrogen. A more realistic and attainable example is this example I have on the screen. This is aerial imagery in early spring of some almond acreage, 160 acre blocks. What I've put up there is the final yield from each of those plots. If all of these individual fields received 275 pounds of nitrogen, which is a fairly common rate in this part of the world, then you derive efficiencies of nitrogen use anything from 35 through to an apparent greater than 100%. Now, the point of this slide is simply to illustrate the need for field-specific management as opposed to property-specific management and getting to the specificity of an individual orchard or vegetable crop in managing and deciding upon your fertilization rates. It appears a fairly trivial analysis, and yet it's a very important one because it's not been the context that some managers have been working under.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Do you think that sometimes the temptation will be to try to, put more nitrogen in to try to, do the growers sometimes think if I put more nitrogen in, then my lower producing side is going to produce more, when really the recommendation I saw here is to not, sort of follow that temptation?
Yeah, and that's a very good point. And in the workshop, we spent quite considerable time illustrating that you cannot force feed a tree. A tree will eat what it is hungry for, and you don't get additional yield by going beyond satisfaction. So that's a very important point, and one that we've been illustrating a lot in the training workshops. When during the season do you put it on? The curves of nitrogen uptake are available for all manner of crops. This is corn and soybean, and there's some traditional slopes. And basically the principle is to apply your nitrogen when the demand is greatest or immediately preceding the greatest demand, so that you satisfy and don't restrict the crops in any way. That's examples of corn. There's a number of different crops here. This is an example from the work we've been doing in almond. And the important part of this is the yellow part of the curve here, which is the nitrogen going into the nuts. We discussed before how much of the nitrogen proportionally goes into nuts versus trees. So if you contrast the beginning of the season, this brown color, this is the perennial portions of the tree, with the end of the season, the brown color, that's only 25 pounds difference in total nitrogen in the tree biomass, whereas the yellow portion represents 320 pounds of nitrogen in this particularly high cropping yield. So this gives guidelines for the whens and the wheres of application. What sort of efficiencies can we achieve?
Patrick, could you give some idea of, when we talk, and I know it may vary somewhat, but when we talk about pounds per acre of nitrogen, what does that translate in typically, given application costs and so forth per pound?
Yeah, that's a good question there. I think 100 pounds of nitrogen, I'm just going to ballpark this, is $80, $150. So in terms of the value of the crop, the cost of the nitrogen is fairly trivial, usually in the 5 to 8%, 5 to 10% of production costs, fertilizer costs.
So if you had 1,000 acres and you saved $15 per acre simply by decreasing nitrogen application, that's a considerable savings.
That's a considerable amount of money, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Thank you.
What sort of efficiencies? We've done the long-term trials with this, and I've just circled the optimal efficiencies that we achieved in these experiments. Now, I would point out these experiments had everything right going for them. We were spoon-feeding the right amount of nitrogen at the right time. We were working in an environment down at Buttonwillow where it does not rain, and so we did not get any winter losses. We were irrigating and injecting our nitrogen according to all best practices. But we certainly did achieve, over a multiple year period, efficiencies of greater than 70%. Now, for the reasons I illustrated previously, not adjusting for yield, not timing correctly, not managing nitrogen correctly, having a lot of in-field variability would all compromise this number. But it is achievable under good circumstances. And I should point out, these sort of efficiency levels, when contrasted with studies done in crops all over the world, are extremely good. Most cropping systems where they have estimated the efficiency of nitrogen use are in the 50% realm. California drip irrigated, low rainfall, well managed. We could certainly do better than that. So Pamela had put a few questions to me. They're not all here. but I'll answer them now. What are the most effective management practices and what annually can be achieved? I think that 4 R's, that balancing the inputs with the outputs, is the key, but it requires in it good knowledge of the physiology of the plant, of what the demand will be, predicting forward what you might expect. It requires in-season adjustment and awareness. If the yield is not as expected, then adjusting accordingly. It requires leaf and soil sampling from time to time to make sure that you're on schedule. I think that has a good deal of attraction to growers because it's intuitive, it's logical, and it is a sort of a self-driven process where the actions of the growers will be reflected in the efficiency of the response, and they can respond accordingly. Does it vary amongst crops? Certainly in the case of the annual crops with large amounts of the nitrogen cycling in the system in the organic matter, that makes life more difficult because the estimations of those recycle nitrogen and the timing of release is important. Irrigation interactions will be discussed by my colleagues. Can organic fertilizers be used? Absolutely. I think there's tremendous potential for more use of organic and dairy waste materials in Californian agriculture. With that comes complexities of how to manage that. With it comes the economic cost. It is certainly easier and cheaper to buy a bag of fertilizer than 10 tons worth of cow manure and to predict what will occur. However, there, of course, are benefits of having that organic matter added to the soil in terms of soil stability. So finally, certainly high efficiencies can be achieved, but they really are heavily based on the knowledge and the education of the grower, the consultant who's managing. But I think the budgeting, balancing approach, as I said, it's intuitive, it's responsive to management strategies, and it's practical. And I think that's a reasonable approach to addressing these issues. Thank you. Questions?
Yes, members of the board? Questions? Bob, yeah.
Just as I think through this, if I were a farmer, if I was like Perry Clausen, of course, I'd be shooting for the perfect number. But a lot of other farmers now, as I understand this, there's the risk of applying too much fertilizer, and that's going to cost you dollars.
Right.
But what that gets you is the risk of applying too low is going to be a poor crop. Is that so? The question to me is that extra dollars that you pay, which can produce, fuller crop, is also an insurance cost to ensure you don't have a poor crop, which may cost you a lot. Is that the kind of calculations that?
Yeah, that has certainly been the calculations been done in a lot of California agriculture, particularly when you recognize the cost of the nitrogen as a proportion of total production costs.
It's only up to 5%.
5-7%, and so would you risk putting on 6% versus or 8% to protect yourself?
Exactly.
Indeed, and I think that's what has been occurring. There is, however, a recognition, I think, amongst growers that I speak with and the crop consultants that once they recognize, that's why they were doing what they were doing, there is an awareness that they can cut back and get a bit more specific in addressing if a tenth of the field is hungry, then you need to solve the needs of the tenth of the field and not by applying more to the 100% of the field. And I think that's become more and more recognized as a practical approach. We have some
So
technological
incentives for good management are helpful, but also having regulation to discourage bad management seems part of the issue here.
I think so.
And I think we're going to hear later that particularly in tree crops that over-fertilization can in fact affect tree health, adversely affect
Yeah,
tree
I mean,
health.
the longevity of your tree crops becomes a big issue in that regard, I think, too, doesn't it? Is there information available on the long-term use of excessive nitrogen versus the life of an orchard?
Two attributes there. One, we've certainly done a lot of work and demonstrated that excess nitrogen can increase your disease risk. That's fairly well established. We have trials going on right at this very moment in year 12 of addressing that question of high nitrogen, high water, what will it do to the longevity of orchard and productivity of orchard versus more constrained nitrogen and
Then
water.
you're looking at your lifetime
And
cost.
we're looking at that lifetime. Of course, that, is in an almond tree and a walnut orchard, that's a long experiment.
Yeah, we have somebody in this board that knows about that.
Yes.
You mentioned sort of staying up and watching the plant, but what kind of frequency of monitoring should growers look to have as an ideal? I mean, they're not going to be out there checking every day. And in your example saying of almonds, are they out there every week, every couple of weeks, every month? I mean, just an idea.
So in the case of the tree crops, we have been working on some online tools that would have one pre-season estimate of yield based on yield history and known productivity of that plot, a second immediately after flowering, a third at harvest. And so in the almond scenario and likely pistachio and walnut, you're talking 3 or 4 assessments. One of the challenges with doing fewer assessments than more assessments is if you only did 1 or 2, then you only have 1 or 2 adjustment phases. And if you got it wrong for the first 2, you have no room to adjust on the third. So that, I think one of the, if a 70% or a 65% efficiency ratio is established and growers find they cannot maintain productivity with that efficiency ratio, then the question should be, well, where am I going wrong and what can I adjust? Do I need to get out there more often? Do I need to subdivide my fields? So I think the balance approach that Perry Clarkson and others have been talking about has that feedback loop in it where a grower can challenge himself with, why isn't this working when it should?
Sounds like a development of an app coming up right here. I see it.
I just want to thank you for your presentation. It was a lot of information in a short time, but it was really great. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to get a copy of the presentation so I can spend a little more time looking at it.
You're welcome.
I have a couple questions. I think the statement that you said, and I wrote it down, that you cannot force feed a tree that it's only going to eat what it's hungry for, is a very powerful statement. And I'm wondering, I know this presentation has gone out to crop advisors. I'm wondering how much outreach those crop advisors or you or your PhD candidates are doing to growers with that. Certainly with the almond orchard that you showed, half, if you just do some minor tweaking per lot, then you've got a huge efficiency. But then also the statement, I'm wondering how much outreach you have been able to do.
So we've been doing a lot of outreach with these training programs, so much so that my doctor said, Brown, you're not allowed to talk for the next month. Here I am. And certainly the almond industry, pistachio industry, walnut industry have been very aggressive. Similarly in the Central Valley, they've been very aggressive with Tim Hart's and Michael Kahn's work as well. The training program that was developed is publicly available for all the CCAs, both for those who have not yet taken the test and those who wish to refresh. And we're working very actively with a number of coalitions and regional growers groups to spread the word as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to reach out to CCAs, but sometimes growers don't always believe they're CCAs. And so some direct data to them is also very helpful. Yeah. And then my other question, I think probably goes to Pamela, but maybe you can answer it as well. The nitrogen budgeting that we're going to be asking growers to do, will that be a block by block basis, where will growers, when they're doing their budgeting for the year, be able to look at, their 40-acre block and their 40-acre block and adjust as
That's a Clay question.
Clay or Joe?
A Joe question, excuse me.
Yes, I think there are a couple of different issues, right, in terms of the nitrogen management plan and then the reporting. And so, and that's something we're still going to be working on. We're waiting for the results from the expert panel to help advise us on how best to track and report. So, and part of our hope, and I think that this is true of with Doug and the CDFA putting the training together for the CCAs, is to do something that makes sense for the growers, and then so that they can do the best job possible, and then use that information. We consolidate. If you remember, there's that sort of pyramid we talked about at the last meeting, so that we get the information we need so we can look at what's going on overall. So the bottom line is, whatever's going to work best for the growers in terms of developing that nitrogen management plan is what we'd like to see. As far as what the order says, it's crop specific it's property specific. So we're looking for that at sort of a minimum. And like what Patrick was saying is, even in, the way we have it set up is you could potentially have a grower that say has like, a lot of acres, hundreds of acres. And the way we've set up is we've actually said, well, if you're doing the same sort of practices, everywhere, you could report it that way. Now, what he's saying is that may not really make sense, and that may not be in the best interest of the grower to really do things that consistently between their different fields.
Yeah, and it'd be hard as a grower to harvest in 40-acre blocks and separate out the blocks, the
Right.
yields from each of those as
We,
well.
we do have Alan Fulton who will be speaking to monitoring.
Yeah, and so what we're trying to be careful of is we're trying to be careful in the order is not to really direct things in a way that would really tell the farmer how to farm, but trying to get more at, what's the potential impact of those practices on groundwater quality. And so that's why there really is a lot of flexibility at this point in how to design the templates, both the nitrogen management plan template as well as the nitrogen management plan summary report, which would be the information that comes to us.
Great, thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions for Professor Brown before we move on?
Out of do you have the list of those questions that you said Pamela had wrote up?
I had 5 of the 9
Okay,
were on
because I
that.
have 7, on number 7.
And some of
You
the
have that
addition. I don't, but go ahead. I can remember it. I'm
I
pretty sure.
believe that Dr. Parker could speak more to that
Okay.
question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hey, this is a really exciting presentation. Like, I'm really into it. This is really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're not litigating either.
Makes a lawyer want to be a professor.
Good morning, members of the board, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to be here today. I thought with the short period of time that I had today.
Sir, introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, Dan Monk, UC Cooperative Extension Farm Advisor.
Great.
Irrigation, Soils, and Cotton Farm Advisor. And today I thought with the time that I had, I'd try to provoke just a few ideas about some of the issues and existing management tools that we're using to help minimize some of the deeper movements of nitrogen, or potential for deeper movements in nitrogen in the soil, and thereby improving or the opportunities for increased or improving our groundwater quality situation. So let's see. Okay, there we go. So in doing that, I thought I'd break the talk up into about 4 different areas. I thought I'd talk in terms of timing during the season. I'd talk a little bit about the pre and early season nitrogen management issues and concerns, and just highlight a couple of issues there. Then move to some in-season concerns and practices
Dan,
that might be useful.
Dan, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you have to scoot. We record all of our board meetings.
Okay.
So you need to speak to this microphone more.
And then talk a little bit about nitrogen application timing and irrigation practices, which certainly can have an impact on the movement and mobility of nitrogen in the soil. And I'll finalize that with just some general comments about irrigation systems and some of the water management concerns. So one of the things that I studied early on in my career, and we do see this in our agricultural production systems, is high infiltration rates and the problem that presents in some cases, particularly with surface irrigated systems. So we're talking about furrow and flood types of systems. And the thing that we sometimes forget is that each irrigation event, particularly in the surface irrigated systems, is different from another. And they actually do follow a general trend line in which very early season, even winter pre-irrigation events are probably the highest infiltration rates of the season. And what that means is we're applying a lot of water, and not all of it might not be being stored in the soil, and therefore these are actually opportunities, I think, for leaching to occur, but also opportunities by growers to manage those systems. So we think of these events or periods of time when the system is more manageable. What are some of the things that growers are doing to combat that issue or problem? Well, there's been a lot of movement to reducing the run lengths of irrigation runs. So if you shorten up those runs, you basically have that water will reach the end of the furrow or at the end of the flooded system much quicker, and you'll apply a lot less water. You'll actually have a more efficient and more uniform irrigation. Similarly, if you increase the flow rate, this is another method and approach that's been used to limit that. And we've seen transitioning systems over the years where growers have actually, where this has been a real problem, high infiltration rates have been a problem. We've moved to things like sprinkler pre-irrigation, where hand-moved sprinklers, in the case of annual cropping systems, have been used to limit and actually apply a more specific amount of water as opposed to just having it fall back onto surface infiltration rates as being the controlling factor. And then obviously we've also seen a lot of transition in more recent years in moving these, just changing the system altogether, moving away from furrow and flood systems to pressurized systems such as sprinkler, and a lot of drip irrigation has been installed. So the other issue that is of particular concern early in the season is the impact of residual nitrogen concentration in surface soils. Now, in some soils, there's actually fairly low nitrate levels are maintained throughout the season, particularly in some of the tree and fruit crops, for instance. Grapes are another example where high residual nitrogen contents just are not present. However, in many of the annual cropping systems, and even in some of the permanent cropping systems, we do see significant amounts of nitrates in soils that have been left over from the previous season. These can be measured. Pre-plant nitrogen tests and pre-side dress nitrogen tests are fairly common. They're being used, and they help identify the amount of nitrogen that's in the soil already at the beginning or in season to help allow us to support a good nitrogen recommendation. They're relatively low cost, and they don't have a huge time requirement, and so these are practical approaches to nitrogen management. And they certainly support the nitrogen balance approach that's being developed and implemented and supported by the coalitions. To give you a little bit of an example, in the case of annual cropping systems, I thought I'd show you that there is a wide variation in some of the residual soil nitrate levels in soils. In some of these systems, they've been rotated. For instance, in the Merced County system here, this is a cotton study that was done in the late 1990s. In the Merced County system, for instance, we were rotating from a vegetable crop and into cotton. And some of these other systems, we had various different rotations. Some of these are cotton rotations. Some of these are rotated from wheat or other vegetable crops, alfalfa. And this gives you a sense for the fact that, one, residual nitrate can play a very important role in supporting new crop or current crop year nitrogen needs, but that it's also highly variable, and therefore we need it's an important component, something vital, I think, to measure in our management systems. So to sort of summarize a couple of the comments there, for leaky systems, that is systems that we have high infiltration rates and the potential for deep water movement. There are opportunities to identify these infiltrations, specific events. They may not be a problem throughout the season that lead to deep leaching, but it's also difficult to directly measure infiltration rates in soils. Residual nitrogen concentrations in the surface soil can be significant, and the measuring of that nitrate, especially in annual cropping systems, is a key component to a nitrogen management system. High residual nitrate, however, with over-application of water can lead to the degradation and deep movement of nitrogen, leading to groundwater degradation. But there's also many systems out there that have fairly low residual nitrogen levels, and over-application of water is not as much of a concern when it comes to water quality concerns. It's also an element of recharge, and that's been an important component over the years that we've recognized and can help balance the groundwater management in a sub-watershed. So some of the in-season nitrogen issues and practices that I thought I'd bring to the attention is keeping up with crop nitrogen demand. And this follows some of Professor Brown's discussion on the timing. And timing can be very critical, and this illustration is that of corn, in which very high rates of nitrogen over a very short period of time are required. Up to about 10 pounds of nitrogen per day are consumed during that period between about 8-leaf and early tasseling of corn, where about 40% of the nitrogen is used over a very short period of time. So timing and rate are very critical for all crops, but this just sort of emphasizes an example where very high rates of nitrogen are required over a very short period of time. So keeping up with, in terms of keeping up with the nitrogen demand, each crop does have a specific demand for nitrogen. There is a yield-dependent component of this. I think Dr. Brown already really addressed that, and I think that that needs to be a consideration. It also allows us for some in-season management where we might actually go out and evaluate yield potential and then make some changes in our earlier recommendations that occurred early in the season. New tools are becoming available in terms of the nitrogen balance of the system, and tools like USDA developed NLEAP, and then we're actually looking at some new tools with UC Cooperative Extension on nitrogen management. And this is just an example of some of the output that comes from Marsha Campbell Matthews' program, where she's looking at forage systems, and where basically there's been an identification of specific crop needs and crop requirements. Let me go back on, oops, not sure if I can, there we go. So there's basically what we have a demand component of the model. We have basically there's a supply side element of this. We're looking at irrigation water inputs, and we also have in this model we've incorporated irrigation events that have nitrate and groundwater summarized, and we can see that the timing of irrigations and the amount of irrigations are being simulated in this example, and basically giving us a good reporting and a management tool to assist us in better utilizing the timing and amounts of nitrogen in that system. Plant monitoring is also something that we're doing in season. It's not available for all crops, but there are a number of crops where we do have good guidelines that represent significant acreage out there. Petiole testing and leaf blade testing of nitrogen mid-season, early to mid-season, can be an important part of nitrogen management in our systems, and they are being utilized. Perhaps the development could be improved and increased on a number of crops, but this can be an important element of in-season nitrogen practices. So basically, to reiterate, each crop does have a very specific period of nitrogen demand and with very high rates of uptake over relatively short periods of time. And then nitrogen budgeting estimates are available for many of the key Central Valley crops. Monitoring of nitrogen content in plant tissues does offer a positive tool for many of these crops, and guidelines have been developed but need to be developed for additional crops. And I'd like to finally talk a little bit about the application of nitrogen during irrigation events. And I thought I'd pull an example of some work that was done by Dr. Larry Schwankel on the Davis campus, who looked at liquid sulfur he basically dripped it in the irrigation water on these surface irrigated, basically furrow irrigated systems. And the idea was to figure out, what is the most efficient timing of applying that material during the irrigation event. And so basically he applied the liquid sulfur at different periods of time. Sometimes initially, as soon as that water started, he'd apply that liquid sulfur, and then at various times later on during the irrigation event in other treatments. And in this example that I'm showing here, the liquid sulfur drip was applied at about 750, when the furrow had advanced about 750 feet on a 1,000-foot run. And by the time it reached 850 feet, that sulfur had already caught up to the end of the field. Just to give you an idea of how this experiment went. Well, the bottom line of all of this is that basically if you apply the materials during the entire irrigation event, this provided the most non-uniform application of nutrient, as opposed to applying that nutrient much later in the irrigation event. So the guideline here that's been developed is to basically move beyond, make sure that water moves beyond the 75% mark up to the 85% mark, and you'll increase the uniformity of application. So again, an example of a tool that can be used to help improve the uniformity of fertilizer applications. There's been some additional work, some parallel work, if you will, over in Jan Hotman's lab, where they looked at modeling the system and the impact of fertigation timing on nitrate uptake by tree systems. And what they found here is basically they did the same kind of idea. They applied the nitrogen in a 24-hour irrigation set for the first three hours, and then subsequent 3-hour applications later on, to see how that might impact the movement of that nitrogen in that irrigation event. And what they found was basically that if you front load or put the nitrogen on very early in the irrigation event, you tended to have much more deep movement, and that's what you see there in that orange figure down at the bottom there in the 0 to 3 hour segment. Basically shows you higher concentrations of nitrate much lower in the soil profile, as opposed to waiting or delaying that application of nutrient until later in the irrigation event, where you tended to have much lower levels of nitrates down deep. And of course, this is so if we're addressing the question of whether or not the timing and the rate of nitrogen injection affect the movement of nitrogen in soil, the answer is yes, absolutely. And that applications moved to the later part of the irrigation in both of these systems led to a more shallow placement of nitrogen, where the root uptake tends to be much more improved and deep movement of nitrogen minimized. The nice thing about this type of a practice is it really doesn't cost any additional time. It doesn't cost additional resources. It's just a good management practice that's available out there. So to kind of sum things up briefly, there is a connection, certainly a connection between the irrigation management practices and the nitrogen movement in soils. It's identifying some of these events or periods of time when we're doing re-wetting, for instance, in some of our permanent crop systems where we have low volume irrigation. Some of those events that might be targeted as in terms of times or opportunities where deep leaching might be occurring, those would be opportunities to look further into the possibility of deep leaching of nitrogen. But not all of these leaky systems degrade groundwater quality. Nitrogen management plans and the budgeting approaches that are being proposed include the measurement of residual soil nitrate, and I feel that that's one of the key elements in many of the systems that we look at in our agricultural systems. This is a key component to the nitrogen balance. Certainly not the only component. Dr. Brown addressed a couple of the other important elements, certainly irrigation water. That can be a very significant element. And also mineralized nitrogen residual from a previous crop is a key element as well. Some of the new computer management models can be useful as an educational tool. Practical nitrogen budgeting tools but we do need more experience, and we need to work with them more. They're very good educational tools. I think they're also useful. Some of these, the way they're being developed, are good management tools as well that can be used while conducting operations in various individual fields. There are also known nitrogen practices. I identified a couple of them here that require a little effort and cost to result in reduced potential for deep movement of nitrates. So with that, I'll conclude my comments unless there are questions.
Very interesting, Dan. Separate from this workshop, I'd like to talk to you about the mathematical modeling, but that could go on for a long time.
Okay.
Are there any questions or comments? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Alan Fulton, Farm Advisor up in Tehama County, and I work in, serve the areas of Tehama, Glen, Colusa, and western Shasta County. Give me a second here and I'll find my presentation. Let's see. There it is. Okay, so among our team today, I have the task of speaking to record keeping and reporting to gauge efficient nitrogen management. I believe this was your question number 9 in the list that was submitted to us. Questions about what kind of information do we need to
Excuse me,
judge?
could you speak up just a little bit for our
Sure.
system? Thank
Okay. So basically the question of what kinds of information do we need to judge good nitrogen management on a individual farm basis. So this is a subject that is a little different from the rest of the subject that we've spoken about this morning, in the sense it's not something that we've researched, okay? And I'm going to draw a little bit from my own participation in the California Department of Food and Ag task force that recently completed. And to be honest, in a little bit, I'm going to just have to relay my own professional opinion, and we can work with it from there, okay? So as I think about record keeping and reporting information, so we can gauge nitrogen use efficiency, I see two challenges come to mind for me. We need effective reporting that can be done with limited time, personnel, and money, and I think that's true from a regulatory point of view, and it's true from the ag community point of view that is being regulated. I think we're trying to, we have some shared common objectives. We want to protect the groundwater quality, and we want to sustain productive farming. And in order to do that, we need to come up with a reporting process that works smart, concentrates on areas with the most potential benefit to both groundwater quality and to sustaining our farming industry. And along these lines, in my own mind, I think there's some potential pitfalls. And one is attempting to accomplish too much too fast when faced with a large-scale non-point source issue like we have. I personally am concerned about too much reporting that generates too many records to compile and interpret, whether it's the third-party coalition group that's compiling and interpreting or your staff. And in the end, it creates delays or maybe dysfunction within your own regulatory efforts. So now I'm going to kind of switch over to the kinds of information that's available that can contribute to reporting, and maybe where it fits into the question of when to report it, kind of thing. And the first couple items, about the next 4 slides, are going to be things that you've probably already thought about some. I'm sorry, I'll step up here closer. But we've heard discussions about the nitrogen hazardous index. If you're not familiar with it, at the very bottom bullet is a website that the University of California offers. It's a pretty simple, concise discussion I bring to your attention. But in essence, it's a process. It was one of the first times it was proposed was by the Natural Resource Council as far back as 1993. And it's a process to identify and give priority to the most vulnerable areas for groundwater contamination, in this case nitrate. And what its attempt to do is to start to meld together different scientific disciplines. And if you look at the bullet there, you kind of have your hydrologic sciences. It attempts to look at the setting, the ag setting, from a hydrologic perspective, changes in climate, your soils, the hydraulic conductivity, depth to water table, and it can be refined many different ways. Then the next bullet down kind of offers the agronomic perspective. It's the crops we're growing, how we rotate them. Are they high nitrogen users? Are they not? Are they deep rooting crops or shallow rooting crops? And again, we're trying to meld these disciplines together, and it brings in some of the engineering discipline as well about irrigation design, irrigation methods. And what this index is doing is starting to match them up. Do we have good methods with the right soils, with the right crops? And what it helps us do is identify where the areas are that are greatest risk, and also where there's areas that we can continue to do effective leaching, because we do know that leaching is important to maintaining our groundwater levels, our groundwater supply reliability. So probably the goal isn't to totally eliminate leaching, it's to eliminate leaching where nitrate can be carried with it. So in essence, this index assigns a risk rate, 1 generally low and going to over 20. And what I would add to it is this nitrogen hazard index was developed both in public sector, but it's been taken and refined and used within the private sector. And so it's certainly a place, a tool, and the type of information that we can be looking at. And just a few more things on the nitrogen hazardous index. Right now, to my understanding so far, it does look like it's being incorporated into use for the irrigated lands program purposes, but tending to be a little more at this point at the watershed scale or sub-watershed scale. And if you read into it a little bit, you'll find some of the UC experts, particularly the Riverside campus, have suggested that maybe there's a point it's more appropriate at the farm level. So incorporating the nitrogen hazardous index is an important tool to working smart and efficiently. And the nature of this reporting is a relatively infrequent. Once the index is established, it's a relatively infrequent reporting process, unless you're working in a highly vulnerable area and you start making improvements and you want to see how that assessment changes. So
I'd like to make a couple observations at this point. I think it's an important tool, as you pointed out, but it's simply one of many. You mentioned that maybe it was Riverside folks talking about it should be used at the farm level. I think, as we've seen again today, it's probably at the field level and maybe even at the subfield level, because if you don't move that nitrogen out of the root zone, you're not, in other words, if you don't leach it down farther, you basically don't have a problem as far as water quality is concerned. It's there for future years, which really gets back to the whole issue of, and I should have asked Dan about this, the importance of irrigation and irrigation monitoring insofar as possibly use of soil moisture probes, and how important is knowing how much water you're putting on each part of the field, given soil types and so forth. How important is really maintaining your drip system if you're going drip, because there's been a lot of criticism on water use efficiency of furrow and flood. It was pointed out that the surge irrigation technologies can get around a lot of this with short runs, but there's been drip systems out there with only a 30% uniformity just due to poor maintenance. So all of these factors enter in, and when you go to one big gross management system like this, it's a good tool, but it's only a tool. Would you agree with that?
I would agree. I'm actually going to speak to a little bit about some of the methods you touched on.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's just one piece that's out there, one of the kinds of pieces of information, and it seems to have a place in this. The next thing is the nitrogen management plans, which Dr. Brown essentially walked you through some examples, and this has been discussed many times. The coalitions seem on board and this, as a practical tool. And the frequency appears to be somewhat on an annual kind of track, and might be influenced by the vulnerability levels associated within different watersheds and such. And as he pointed out, I've just highlighted the 4 R's again here that the nitrogen budget gets at. And I'll just emphasize the last bullet, the last R, the right end fertilizer placement and the influences of irrigation. So if we work through a nitrogen budget and the rate, the timing, and the source look right, but we still see a high proportion of applied fertilizer to what we think our research base says the crop demand is, this starts to point out too, well, that maybe the nitrogen practice itself is not the limiting factor, and maybe there is an interaction with irrigation. So let's see if I can get this moved. So another advantage of the nitrogen management plan as a tool along with the nitrogen hazard index is it seeks to, it's a way being proposed right now that we can map and we can see the current levels, we can see progress, we can identify outliers and know where to begin to concentrate our efforts. And I think an important piece to this, I think it can be complementary to your groundwater quality trend monitoring that's been proposed, and help by seeing the current management plans. If the current management plans look reasonable, but you're still seeing issues with groundwater quality, it helps start to distinguish this question between practices now and legacy effects from practices many years ago. So, the part I guess I really need to get to is the connection between the nitrogen and irrigation management. When I participated in the task force, there was a lot of question, can you track nitrogen and not pay more attention to the water management? And the fact is that irrigation management influences nitrogen management efficiency. So we wrestled with the question, so what about record keeping and reporting for irrigation management practices? And this is where I'm going to kind of get into my own opinion here a little bit. If detailed record-keeping reporting of irrigation management practices were required, the Irrigated Lands program could find itself on the verge of excessive reporting and could lead to dysfunction. I think there might be a time and place. If you can kind of drill down through your process and find your most vulnerable areas, there may be a time and place where there's maybe more need for reporting on irrigation, and I'll try to explain why I have this opinion. Growers at the farm level have different tools that they can turn to make their water management decisions, to judge when to irrigate and how much water to apply. They can do a water budget that's kind of similar to a nitrogen budget. They can monitor soil moisture levels, and we have tools to detect crop stress. Or we can use some combination of the three. And I think one of the places we're going to want to be looking for is information that if they're not using any kind of scientific tools, okay? So I want to just give you a little background on the kinds of approaches and methods that growers are using, and what I hope to give you is a sense of the kind of the level of detail that's there, and if you had to report it, the volume of data and types of things it would create. So the first is a water budget, which is simply creating an estimate of the water use over the season and as it accumulates over the course of the season, and comparing it to the water supply from irrigation, from your effective rainfall, which can be highly variable depending on where you are at in the Central Valley. To get at these estimates of crop water use, many of us have heard of the CIMMYS program, California Irrigation Management Information System. It's a network of standardized weather stations. This is a photo of one showing it's standardized. It's measuring the evaporative demand on a grass surface. So the thing we have to do to apply this real-time weather, we have to then convert it, relate it to a different crop. In this case, I used walnut because that's what I work for. And a walnut orchard looks very different than a grass crop or grass pasture. So we develop crop coefficients, and what this table shows an example of crop coefficients for walnut, and what it is an adjustment to the grass reference measured with the weather station for the change in canopy over the course of the season. And this is just a series of slides from our late leafing Chandler variety just starting to break dormancy, and then moving through the canopy, and it's just trying to show you here the idea behind the crop coefficient. In the end, if I'm using a water budget, I'm relating the real-time estimates of water use by the crop for the specific season to how my irrigation system performs. And I have a weekly estimate from what I think the weather weather demand on ET was, and I have an irrigation system that I know is designed a certain way or runs a certain way to put out a certain amount of water. I'm running them to strike a balance and also account for soil storage that might be in the profile from the winter rains, or in the case further north, the rains we're getting as the crops are growing, kind of thing. So this is just an example here. This is kind of a water budget for one field, one almond orchard, and there's a little bit of detail there. And so again, the reason I'm going through this is to give you a feel for the kind of work that's going on, but that can be going on behind the scene, and how it's going to be a challenge if you were to try to capture that level of detail. Okay, so that's the water budget approach. Some of the most popular methods.
No, excuse me.
Yeah.
Can you summarize, because we're running out of time here?
Okay, I got about 4 or 5 more slides. Okay, so one of the more popular methods is the soil moisture sensors. Here on the right, you can see a sample set of data for one field. And then we have a technique for crop stress detection, and see how we can take crop stress measurements and relate it and make decisions about irrigation. So growers can have this kind of information, and when you go to trying to figure out how to report water management type stuff, the point is, the main point I want to make here is the second bullet. There is more than one scientific perspective that can be used to guide irrigation management decisions, and to attempt and report them will generate a diverse and enormous mountain type of data. And I'll just end with the very last point here. Will the effort to go to this level of reporting be useful or overwhelming? And so.
Yeah, I think you may misunderstand what we want on reporting, what stays at the farm, and all of that. This is very important. We don't have the time to go into it. It could take the rest of the day.
Okay.
Pamela, we need to come back on this particular issue, focus in on this particular issue at another workshop. Like I said earlier, you have to make efforts to retain it in the root zone. What does it take to do that? The second part of that is you're going to have to, and we're not even touching on here, is you have to have periodic leaching in some areas to get salts out of the root zone. So we could spend half a day on just more than that on this topic. Are there any quick questions? We'll move on. Thank you very much, sir. You've opened up the Pandora's box, and we're going to proceed in another workshop, I hope, to address this further.
Dr. Longley, if we could have Dr. Parker come back up and
Sure.
speak to
Doug?
Sandra's question, that might be.
Yeah, just real briefly on the sort of the economics and the costs of it. There are not a lot of studies out there on what would be the cost. You can see sort of the different variety of possible management options that people might face. I know that back in the Harder report, some economics was done on the cost of some of the BMP type of management systems, but to get down to the farm level of, say, dividing your furrows in half, lengths, you have to look at what are the labor costs of this, what kind of equipment costs. Do I even have the ability to supply water in that way? How is my water delivered from the water district? So it gets quite complex. So we really don't have a whole lot of answer in terms of the economic costs of it, because it's very specific to the farm. I think in a lot of these studies, when they are doing, when Patrick's looking at different irrigation systems, they are calculating the cost as part of those. But then the question is, how representative is it across different farms? And certainly by crop type, it's going to vary as well.
The example is the impacts on drinking water quality, and other uses of nutrient receiving waters.
Pardon
That
me?
was part of the question.
What was the impact on receiving waters?
The impacts on drinking water quality and other uses of nutrient receiving waters.
Yeah, so I guess these different practices and stuff that are designed to sort of hold those nutrients in the root zone or make sure they get to the crops are designed to help improve drinking water quality, in the sense that if you're keeping that nitrogen where the crop can use it and you're making sure the crop is using it, you're reducing the amount that can be pushed down either into groundwater or running off into surface waters, depending on what type of a system you're in.
Thank you.
Does that help? Sure.